Welcome to the Interlocutor, episode 2 with me, Anthony Anaxagorou. Today I'm joined by the very wonderful Bridget Minamore. Bridget, how are you?
I'm good.
Good. Bridget, for those of you who don't know, is a poet and a journalist. She has written for The Guardian, The Debrief and The Pool. She also has a pamphlet of poetry entitled Titanic that is out on Outspoken Press at the moment. Bridget, the first question I want to kind of ask you is, I once said a few months ago that poets in our generation have become the new journalists. How intertwined is the role of the poet with that of the modern day journalist?
I guess, there are a lot of similarities, maybe not for me. I feel quite strongly that my journalism is quite separate to my poetry. And I don't think it's any surprise that the more journalism I've started to do, the less obligated I've felt to write about politics. Because I was getting out, my anger, my feelings, my sadness in another way. But I do think for a lot of poets, I guess what's the role of a journalist is maybe the question then. Yeah. Is it to educate and inform? It's also like propaganda. And I think all of those elements can be found in poetry, can't they?
Yeah, there isn't a strong argument that says that all poets are rhetoricians to an extent. So could you kind of say that even within journalism, there is an element of commentary, and within poetry, there is an element of commentary, there is an element of documentation of a particular time. However, what is it that within poetry, it's a question that I get asked quite a lot, what is it within poetry that appeals to people more, per se, than journalism or particular kind of people?
I think it's easier. I genuinely think it's as simple as people feel emotion much more strongly than they absorb logic and facts. And so, there have been some incredible pieces of journalism in the last year or two about, let's say, the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean. And you have journalists getting nominated for awards for these 4,000 long reads interviewing all these immigrants. But then those feelings can be quite quickly and simply replicated, maybe in a false way, from a 3-minute poem about crossing the sea. And I'm not saying it's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but emotion is pretty easy to replicate in poetry a lot faster. And so I think that is why, as times get tougher, we find more and more people speaking on these issues and realizing. And I'm not saying, I don't think the problem is, I think with poetry, is that you can't get as much fact. And that's the problem. Right. You can't get as much fact in a poem. You just can't. But you can get maybe more emotion. Yeah.
And I think the emotive element of art in general is what makes it more appealing to a lot of people. However, there is a strong argument that will say that, I'm in agreement with you here, Minamore. I fully agree with what it is that you're saying, and it's something, obviously, we both work in poetry, so it's something that we have to kind of navigate often. But I do think that within poetry, there is, I guess, a proponent within it that looks to solve some kind of, or to kind of come to some kind of truth. And I think that that is what's more interesting. Whereas if you look at more robust and rigorous styles of writing, be it academia or be it in journalism, they're centered around a particular kind of truth and a particular kind of proselytizing. However, within poetry, it doesn't necessarily have to follow logic in the same way as what academia does.
I really agree with that. Academia, I think poetry is a real unique case in that you almost are allowed... No, people want to come to conclusion. And so whether it's a slam piece or something on a page, a poem has to end, right?
Right.
And
or does it?
I'd argue that all good poems have some sort of ending, even if the ending is an open question, but something needs to come full circle, even if the circle is very small, right? And so, but I guess in comparison, a lot of journalism aims to ask questions. And I think you can ask those questions in poetry, but I think in poetry, you need to have some sort of neat conclusion, like the poem needs to end.
And isn't journalism about investigation?
Yeah.
It's about
whereas
reporting.
Poetry just isn't.
Exactly. It's about circling something that is essentially quite abstract, quite nebulous, and trying to find the language or words that fit around the abstraction.
Yeah, I think it comes back to that emotion, and I almost feel that with poetry in comparison to journalism, the emotion is almost like in the in-between, in that sort of liminal bit between them.
Subtext,
Whereas in journalism, the emotion isn't in between. Like a good piece of journalism doesn't hide its emotion. It needs to really bring that up.
I'm interested in what you said at the beginning about the idea that we connect more with things that we have an emotional response to, as opposed to things that we kind of find very straight. So, you read a news article, you'll be like, okay, cool, or that's really bad, or that's terrible, but you never really think about the journalist per se, or the author, but when it comes, unless you're someone like Owen Jones or Pilger or someone like this who is more of a brand than opposed to the actual writing. But if you think about 99% of journalists that you read, you never really look at the name and the author and where it's coming from. How important is, I guess, a journalist's own political stance? Because obviously we know about the Daily Mail, and there's a lot of people that work there that are actually quite liberal. However, they write these real crass articles that
I mean, I find that really, maybe because of the way I got into journalism, which was a complete fluke, in the same way I got into poetry, which was also a complete fluke. And in both those situations, people saw my writing and were like, hey, with the poetry, like these plays you're writing, they're poems, let's make them poems. Okay, I'm doing this for a couple of years. I'm with journalism. I was writing these longer and longer poems that had very little structure, and it was like, you want to write an article, Bridget? And I started doing that, and I fell into that very easily. And so I was always like political, but then not a political journalist. I just came at it from myself. I find it really difficult to imagine like the cognitive dissonance required to be like a liberal person working for the Daily Mail. There are people who are like, my friend was like, she got asked out on a date by this guy, and she was like, I don't understand. And a job is a job, but I'm like, if here he is, like a young black guy who's worked his way up from a liberal family, who's very liberal himself, I don't know how you do it. I don't necessarily judge it too harshly, although, we've all got our personal lines. I don't know if I could...
I guess it's a matter of integrity. I think with a lot of these things, it just boils down to how far are you willing to go.
How far are you willing to go? Yeah. I mean, to be fair, like I'd go quite far. I find it really interesting. I've been thinking about that a lot. And, there's questions as the world becomes more capitalist and more commercialized, and poetry gets more commercialized, like... these questions are coming up more and more and more. And so, I've been quite silent on it because I don't think I've really worked out my ideas yet. I've seen lots of conversations recently about, the poet and the advert, which seems to have sprung out of nowhere, which I find really interesting. And then you think, okay, we can't say a blanket yes, we can't say a blanket no, but where are we drawing the line? So I saw Sabrina's Oxfam thing, and, that had some really good traction, but then it's not got as good traction, I guess, than like a big bank advert. Yeah. And you're like... that's a real shame, because obviously there's Oxfam and there's a bank, but then for the poet, what's the difference? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's a matter of ethics. And are you going to go and write a poem for a bank? They're going to give you £60,000-70,000. Or you're going to go, obviously, I don't think they're going to give that money. I was going to say, mate, if it's £60,000, hello, exactly. What is it in NatWest, Nationwide, HSBC, are you listening?
I reckon they're probably... I reckon banks will probably give a poet around 10 grand.
Do you think? I reckon. That's what I would think. I reckon a bit more, to be honest.
But then you have to think about your own career and what you stand for and your principles. And I think that
people need money and have kids and all that stuff.
But it can become ruinous in the sense of your reputation. If you become the poet who ended up selling out because
But then McDonald's, I think we've all sold out in a little way.
To an extent, I think you have to.
And I think you just need to, there are things that... I don't know. I feel like secretly most people have written something for big organizations, and you have to think like why is this one? I mean, there are clear like villains, right? And there are clear heroes. Like Oxfam is clearly like not a villain, right? Yeah. And it's easy to like pigeonhole a bank as a villain, right? But it's just not that simple a lot of the time. It's just not that simple. And so, some people would say, I'm not going to write a poem for... Didn't someone do something for like the British Museum or something?
Maybe. McDonald's or Starbucks. I think Starbucks and McDonald's are really problematic in the sense of the Guantanamo issue and, consumers and whatever else.
But then maybe a small... even like a museum. I have people who won't go to the British Museum because it's a site of colonialism, which I agree with. But then I'm like, would I say no to writing a poem for them? Probably not. But some people would. So I don't know. We all have our lines. I think it's just I think it's easy right now because there's not that much of it. But as time goes on and as poetry continues along the trajectory that it's going on, I think we'll have more we'll have more questions about that. We'll have more things about that.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Titanic now, and kind of your ideas behind the collection. It's a pamphlet, what you wanted to achieve, what your thinking was behind it, what inspired it. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
I mean, so Titanic, it is 25 poems, I think, and they're very short. And I, like most things in my life, came about with little planning. I just started writing these little vignettes on my phone one day, and it was in probably December 2014, around that time, and I just started writing these vignettes and writing them, and I thought in like February that I had one poem made of 3 vignettes, and that was the first 2 poems in the book and the last one. And so I wrote those 3, and they were all based around this one day. This was the idea. And then I just started writing more, and then I'd read them, but I didn't know. So I'm not a poet who writes short poems, and I find that very, very uncomfortable. I think it's a lot more emotionally raw sometimes to write something very short and to just have that, because you can't rely on like the banter before. I mean, you can, but then it's just ridiculous. If you're doing like a 2 minute bants and then you do like a 30-second poem, it just seems silly. So I found that quite difficult, and so I started writing more and more to basically bulk it out. And then I got to like summer, and I was like, I've got loads of poems, and I started reading them in this weird sort of thing. And then I started toying with with how I could talk about love and talk about heartbreak without not just feeling silly, but by also showing the audience that I didn't want to feel silly, to hide behind something while acknowledging I wanted to hide behind something. And I use music. And so when you start singing like Biggie Smalls lyrics or whatever halfway through a poem, people know very clearly that you're doing this because you feel uncomfortable. But I like that. I liked spelling it out so clearly while not spelling it out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then it just got to a point where I remember I talked to you and you were like, this is, and I was like, I don't know what to do with it. And then at the last minute I was like, Anthony, I want to put this into some I want to edit these.
I think that for me the really nice part about the collection is how it fuses pop culture and something that everyone is really familiar with, like you said, but then it takes on these really massive issues, and it doesn't make light of them, but it looks at them in a humorous way, although there is a really kind of dark undertone to it as well. I've recently,
I think I forget how dark it was, mostly because now, especially when I read it out. So there are videos of me doing it online, but essentially, depending on where I am, sometimes I just read them straight. I read the titles. All the titles are taken from song lyrics, and that's quite fun. But other times I just read them all in a big block. So when I had, in the beginning, I'd number them because I got really obsessed with numbered poems. Something I totally stole, half from the middle bit of Zadie Smith's NW, where she numbers all the vignettes. And Leonie Ross, I saw her read these poems about climate change, and she numbered them all. And I saw these 2 things in the same week. I read the book, and then I saw Leonie, and I was like, I want to do this. I want to steal this. This is like 2 or 3 years ago. And then just kept it on the back. I don't think I've ever told her that.
I think there definitely is something about kind of incrementing the increment in poems. I think that's a particular thing. My only issue with it is that you never know when it's going to end.
I tell people now.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I tell people. Yeah. I think there's a certain power in that, in telling people this is, and I make a joke of it usually. I say, I'm going to read 39 poems for you. Don't get scared. So if you need to go and have a wee, but I'm at like 15, go. But if I'm at like 32, wait. And usually I make that joke and people laugh and they stick with it. But I think there's something really powerful about saying about laying it all on the table. And that was kind of what I wanted to do with the book, I think, with the pamphlet. And so I toyed around with that for ages. I had these really grand plans of how to perform it. And then thought I'd try and make it some sort of show, which I still think about sometimes, but I just hate performing. So just don't want to do that. Like a 20-minute, if I could do like a poetry show tour of like 15 or 20 minutes, that'd be perfect, but you can't. And I actually just cannot be on the stage for more than 20 minutes. I hate it.
That's the interesting thing with the kind of introvert extrovert dichotomy is that you have writers by their very nature are introverted, but then to go up on the stage and employ a different set of attributes becomes the complete antithesis. So you're kind of constantly in this catatonic state where you're like, I need to do this because I need to get the work out there, but then at the same time, stop looking at me.
Yeah, I find it really difficult actually. And I'm someone who's, you know, probably quite a classic extrovert. And I find that dichotomy quite useless actually. I'm sure that there just aren't, it's just so pointless to group us into two things. And I know the definition is technically if you, like, where do you get your energy from? And I was like, it depends. Like I'm definitely someone who loves to talk and I love company and I love friends. But
do you enjoy it? I think that for me is the fundamental question.
I do, but then I also, like, I'm an only child and I need time alone. And like, so last week I had a gig every night for the first time in like months, in like 6 or 7 or 8 months. I hate gigging that much. Like 1 gig a week is like my limit usually, and I had like 5. And I just could not handle it. I've spent the last 3 days completely alone, and I needed to, and I need to balance that. Recalibrate. And I'm very good at being alone. I really enjoy it, to be honest. And it's good for me. And so I don't know what, and I wouldn't call myself introverted necessarily. I find it's sort of become, I don't know, not idealized necessarily, but I've seen so many articles, my God, like what it's like to be an introvert.
There's a big thing about it. But I think I agree with you. I don't think there is a particular, you're either this, it's not a binary thing.
I'm sure some people are like solid extroverts. That might be just narcissists, surely.
Well, it might even be a form of kind of internal turmoil where they're unable to sit with themselves for any longer than 15 minutes, so they constantly need distractions,
which I find really worrying.
I mean, that's a whole different kettle of fish unto itself, but as a whole, I definitely think there is something to be said about someone who can work a stage and invent themselves theatrically and perform a piece of poetry, perform a piece of theatre in a way that is captivating and compelling, whereas, you know, you get certain people that, this was the argument when I first got into poetry, this is what it was about, was that some people can perform and other people just like to read, yet there is something within the reading.
Some people just read but still perform. There are, like, Jack Underwood does it really well. And I always use him as a good example, because I've seen him read and I've seen even videos, and he just I'm not saying he's like jumping around as a spoken word artist, but he makes it interesting, and I kind of feel like you have a bit of an obligation to that. When if you're going to read to someone, you need to give them something that they wouldn't just get from buying your book.
Absolutely.
You know,
I mean, if you go back to the Bible and you go back to sermons, religious sermons, you don't see priests and imams throwing themselves around the place. This is something that is very American, but I think that the idea of a performance itself, there is a certain element of stillness that is just as impacting as when you become overly animated. So I think, it can work in either way. And, you know, from Andrew McMillan to Underwood, like when I've heard these guys read, there is something really captivating about the stillness.
That's what I've tried to really emulate. I think it's something I didn't really have before. And so what I've tended to do now with Titanic, if I read it in the big block, because they're so short a lot of the time, you need a pause. You need to really, or I've really needed to learn how to like pause, how to play with time, and it's been fun. You know, I started writing in theatre. That's where I first, you know, found literature. I love the stage. I love theatre. It's my favorite sort of art form, and I really think that's put me in good sort of stead for the rest of my life. Like, I think, and when you meet poets, the ones who I think do love theatre or write for theatre or have experience in theatre, I think you can see it sometimes, even in just how they work with timing, the Sabrinas and the Inuas, just how you hold your audience, really acknowledging that the audience is the important thing here. And I think poets who are spoken word artists who don't have that theatre background sometimes don't necessarily see that.
But also it kind of seeps through. When poets do have a theatre background, it becomes slightly more thespian.
I think that's acting.
Right.
I think there's a big difference between writing for theatre or writing with theatre.
That's what I'm saying. So you get people that are essentially acting, and that's one of my kind of main reservations is when actors take on.
I find that. Have you heard the story? Who I think maybe Tim was telling me that story about how why loads of actors suddenly got into poetry, because when you needed to sign up for like equity, you needed a certain number of performances on a stage and poetry gigs, so much could count. Right. So loads of actors just suddenly signed up to become poets.
Because there was a massive surge.
Yeah. Oh no, my friend Claudia told me. Claudia, I wrote with her years ago, and she at the National, and she was like, "Yeah, I used to do spoken word," and I was like, "Really? Why? How?" And she was like, "Because I could audition for a play and work really hard, and then eventually after 3 months of rehearsals have 4 performances, or I could go to an open mic once a week." And you're like, fair enough.
Yeah, and then I guess they're still getting the training.
I think it's dying out a little bit. Not, you know what I mean? I feel
there was a lot of comedians, a crossover from comedy as well was coming. There was a lot of comedians, there was a lot of presenters. This was another thing that I realised about 4 or 5 years ago. There were people that were trying to be TV presenters that were then crossing over into poetry.
I think you can always tell though, especially with an actor. You can always tell when an actor's just come straight in.
And it'll be in the language. For me, it's really in the poetry itself. Like, you can be great on a stage, you can be charismatic, you can be, a lot of stage presence, but if the quality of your writing is weak, I think that kind of stuff,
course. Definitely,
you can't buy.
No.
And there's no training for that. Sexism, Bridget Minamore.
This is Anthony's list. He's actually holding up this giant placard with the word sexism on it.
That's it, with a big I, because I want to talk about the intersectional element within it. As a man, one of the things that I'm actually genuinely confused about is what feminism means, because every feminist that I've spoken to, and I regard myself as somebody who is an advocate for equal social, political rights for women and men. However, within the feminist discourse, there are a lot of discrepancies. So for you as a black woman, as a woman of colour, how do you perceive the intersectional elements within that? Because obviously a lot of people identify or regard feminism as a white kind of middle class movement.
Definitely.
So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, the thing, in some ways it heartens me that we're getting to a point that we can really criticize. It's a problem. It's the endless problem of being more than one thing, which is something we all are, right? But some people's more than one thing seem to overwhelm their lives more than others. And I find myself, and I'm sure lots of other black women find themselves stuck in this bind where you want to criticize feminism, but the only people not the only people, but a lot of time people criticizing feminism are angry men. And it's like, I want to be able to unpick the problems in this movement, because like all things are connected. All things are connected. And so feminism as a whole, like the world, has a class issue, has a race issue, has a even like gender issue within that, has a gender and class issue.
An ableist
issue. Age. Like there's so many, even things like childcare or sexuality, like anything that exists in the world, I think we forget. And it's definitely a problem. Obviously, as left people on the left, you hold yourselves, or we want to hold ourselves to higher standards, right? But we need to not forget that, of course, like sexism, ageism, ableism, homophobia, whatever, they all exist on all sides of the political spectrum, all sides.
So society in itself becomes a club, an exclusionary club, and obviously the more you fit the archetypes, the more privilege you'll be afforded to you.
Yeah.
But from where we've seen things at the moment, the way that the shift has moved within feminist discourse, has there been more of a focus now on issues such as hair, such as redefining what black beauty means, redefining the importance of natural hair, the importance of not bleaching skin and not trying to appeal to these white European standards of beauty?
I think so. It's in the black feminist movement. And I think even what actually is better than, I think, the hashtag black feminist movement as a whole is the fact that these things are happening slowly and naturally. And I think hair is a really good example of that. When I was a teenager, we all had this ideal of beauty and we all tried to reach that. And now I look at my friends' little sisters and none of them have relaxed their hair. And relaxing your hair, whatever, it's such a thorny issue, and I'm not gonna shit on anyone who wants to do that. You do what you want, but I just find it genuinely incredible, and not wow incredible, just we've come things have changed a lot, right? Whether good, bad, or neutral. In my year at school, when I was 16 or 17, everyone relaxed their hair, apart from maybe 1 or 2 girls. And now 1 or 2 girls are the ones who are the only ones to relax their hair.
Yeah.
Very few. Like I look at my friends' little sisters. It was one of their birthdays, and I was like, all of you have your natural hair. I find that genuinely baffling almost, and I think that's incredible. I think things have changed. I mean, it's all part of a wider thing.
What do you think? What do you think has been the cause of that change? Do you think it's
fashion?
Fashion, right?
I think it's fashion. I think there's been a real, especially in black female communities.
In America or over here?
In America and over here as well. I mean, the black British community, black British women or men or whatever, always seems like it's coming behind, always seems like it's smaller because, there just physically are less, numerically less of us. But it's a British thing as well where, black women will come for you and support you. And I think there's a reason why all, things like Galdem have done so well, run by like 19-year-olds when it first started, just saying this is a woman of colour. And it was like this universal thing where loads of people came round and just like doggedly supported them. And I know I felt like that when they asked me to write for their issue. I was like, yes, of course. I don't really have time, but I wanted to. And I think I think there are sometimes some downsides to that. Not with Galdem, I think they're great, but there are other issues that are maybe headed up by women of colour that maybe aren't as good and are still really pushed forward and really supported. But I think we sort of have an obligation to do that. And while the representation is so imbalanced, I will like grit my teeth, and that sounds really strong, but I will grit my teeth and say, I'm going to retweet all of these articles or all of these recommendations or this clothing line or buy this stuff like from wherever, Africa Rights at the South Bank. I'll buy all these like overpriced boutique stuff and then tweet about it because I want this black woman to do well. Yeah. And so, we've got to a really nice point where that's happening, and it's happening more and more.
Do you think though, even, and this is a more contentious issue, I guess, but it's something that I've noticed that even within the fashion houses and within I guess black ideals of beauty, there is still a particular archetype that is being promulgated. Obviously
there's the colorism issue where you notice that a lot of these spokeswomen are quite light-skinned and have a very particular aesthetic. Years ago we used to have people going on about like the Kim Kardashian standard or the Beyonce standard, and I don't think that's necessarily the standard now. There's a particular sort of young, light-skinned girl who, is wearing, I don't know, just like quite cool-looking, quite trendy, does something creative, calls herself a creative, bright lipsticks and African prints, and I think that's just where we are now, and I think there's always going to be something in fashion. I'd like to get to a point, I think we're getting to a point where we can start to unpick that slowly.
Do you think there's still an element of fetishization
definitely
that exists within that, and the exotic? It's always been contrasted to the European, which is always looked at as being more urbane and more classical. And then you obviously get people from the Middle East, you get people from Asia, people from Africa that are always looked at in a slightly more... And you can still see that even within the photographs, within the pictures, within even Instagram. Like you go through Instagram and how hair is depicted and how women use their hair politically.
Yeah. I mean, even I was feeling that so much, and I shaved all mine off. And then even like I was having a conversation with a friend, so like a week ago, I got profiled in this piece with a fader, and it was essentially about women of colour who've shaved their hair off, and I was like, I guess it's become a thing, and I wouldn't have dreamt of shaving off my hair.
What was the intention behind that?
I just was so bored. I'm really, really lazy I'm an all or nothing sort of person, and I either spend my time on something and make it perfect, or I just don't bother. And my hair has been one of those struggle things in my life for my whole life. And I had one of those accidental sort of big chops, they call it, when you shave off your hair and go natural, right? I was 18 or something, and my mum was taking out my braids, where you cut out the braids and then you loosen them, and she just cut out, her hand slipped and she just cut a big chunk in the middle, and I freaked out, I screamed, I cried, and then I had this big patch, so she just cut everything down, and then she was like, you know what, just braid your hair for 6 months and then we'll relax it after that, and then you'll just have a short cut. And I was like, cool, fine. And I got to 6 months and I was like, I don't have thin hair like I've always thought, I don't have weak hair, I have actually massively strong, massively thick hair, and this is interesting, let's try this. And, you know, I always had braids, and I do feel like braids are a big part of my identity, to be honest. Yeah. And I kind of got to a point where I'm like, I'm in my mid-20s now, and this has been the defining part of my look, I think, my whole life. Yeah. I never really managed to deal with relaxed hair even.
How has it affected you psychologically? Like
cutting off the hair.
Cutting off your hair. Has it strengthened? Do you feel stronger as a character, as an individual?
Yeah, I feel like I can't hide as much, just on a more basic level. I feel very like exposed, and I think that's good for me. I feel... I don't know. I feel like I'm a different sort of person, and I'm not sure how to pinpoint that, but I am. And I feel like I look nicer. And I don't know if that's just, I used to feel so like caught up in hiding and not even, with this hair. And I always had so many braids, and I felt so attached to them. And I got this undercut first. I got an undercut to see how I would deal with it. And I was like, oh God. And then I felt sort of conflicted. And I was like, you know what? It's an all or nothing thing, isn't it, really? Yeah. Either I try and grow this undercut out, or I just...
Are you going to grow it back, your hair, or are you going to keep
my hair?
Yeah.
No, not for a while. I've just got very used to it. And it's nice not needing to like... I shaved my own head for the first time a few like a week ago. Yeah.
Was it patchy?
Oh, very. Yeah. Like it's not great, but it's nice knowing that I can learn how to do this very basic life skill for myself. Yeah. And I never learned how to do my own hair. And I really like doing hair. My aunt ran a hairdresser's shop in Glasgow, a black hair shop. And so I spent all my childhood going to Glasgow, getting my hair braided and braiding other people's hair. And I really love the ritual of hair salons. So that's something I probably miss a lot more than the longness and the expense of getting your hair braided, like battling an auntie telling you what you want. But my safe space is a hair salon, I'll tell you that.
Absolutely. Let's move on. Your degree.
My degree?
Your degree. I'm interested to know about what you did at your degree.
English at UCL.
English at UCL. And you did your dissertation. I remember speaking to you about, was it 2 years ago?
Yeah, 2.5 years ago.
2.5 years ago, and you were saying your dissertation sounded incredibly interesting. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So my dissertation. Technically, I did two. I did a shorter piece and then like a longer one. And the shorter one was on Chinua Achebe names, on West African names, and I did all right. But the thing I sort of killed myself over was I looked at African American poets, and I focused. I love the Harlem Renaissance as a time period. I love that form of writing. I love how innovative it was. And I feel very, very strongly that it is just pure racism, that it is elevated to the point of like pure literary genius. And a lot of people, you know, say, oh, the Harlem Renaissance is great. But I was like, yeah, but it's not just good or great. It pushed forward writing in a way that, you know, people like someone like Gene Toomer and what he did with his short story cycle, he called Cane, I think pushed literature forward in the same way that someone like James Joyce did, right? And you'll get critics saying that, like even in the academic establishment, they'll say that, but it's just not widely known, and I find that infuriating. Or someone like Langston Hughes, who's lauded as like this I don't even know, this like big American black poet. But I'm like, no, but he also was technically brilliant. And I think it's very easy to just like pull up black writers, African American writers, and be like, oh, here they are doing well. And I'm like, no, but technically,
let's get into the nuances of what they were doing.
Yeah.
And it's something, it's a level of analysis that is only ever applied to a particular handful of writers, and mainly tend to be white men.
Yeah.
And going back to what you were saying, especially with those guys, and even someone like Baldwin, although Baldwin reached a certain
Baldwin was
level.
Technically brilliant, exactly. and I feel sort of frustrated that he's become like an Instagram meme basically every time there's something contentious about rioting or something. And you know, Baldwin was a great speaker. Yeah. He had an incredible voice when you listen to him, but he also technically was fantastic, and he should be on our syllabuses.
It should be canonized to an extent, which is something that isn't. And this is the problem, I guess. Even when you're looking at Steinbeck and you're looking at what the kids have to learn now, there are so many great writers that came out of the American canon during the 20th century to focus constantly on of mice and men.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of teachers that I've spoken to working in schools are just as fed up with the idea of having to keep teaching.
And that's definitely a race thing. And there are occasionally you'll get some white women leaking through, but there are even then, like you get people like Patricia Highsmith, who essentially made the thriller an amazing thing. There's a reason why so many of her books keep on being made into these award-winning films. She wrote like Talented Mr. Ripley. She wrote so many, I can't even remember. But she's an incredible writer and made the thriller of the thriller, and she isn't canonized in the same way that her male counterparts are, and it just actually drives me to distraction, and you get Zora Neale Hurston and Their Eyes Were Watching God, and it's apparently on like almost every US English reading list, but it's just like, she's an amazing black woman, and I'm like, no. That's a long tangent to get back to my dissertation. So I looked at Langston Hughes, his poems, and I looked at this very little known poet called Richard Bruce Nugent, who I discovered like totally by chance, looking up gay black male poets. And someone just mentioned, arguably the first black man to out himself as gay in literature in America. I was like, what? Why have I never heard of this guy? And he just had a fantastic life. He actually survived longer than all of them, and he was like openly gay. Hughes was never openly gay. None of County Colour or whatever. None of those guys were openly gay, right? But Nugent was, and he lived all the way up until like the early 80s, sort of, I guess, sleeping around downtown with these young guys. And he wrote these, I actually love his short stories. They're sort of poems, short of stories, but it's a real pushing forward of the form. He used to work with ellipses a lot, and he's got this one short story where the only punctuation is ellipses in the whole thing, and it's just so like sexy. It's like scandalous. And I remember reading this being like, why have I never seen this? This is like outrageous. He's written 5 pages of story, and there are only ellipses, and you're like, oh, is it like, are they having sex? Are they not? What's that? And I just thought he was technically brilliant, and so I looked at them and how they both talked about their queerness. Obviously, Hughes a lot less overt, but as he got older, I'd argue that he got more overt with that, and it's beautiful, and I love Hughes. Hughes wrote, and his output is astonishing. Have you seen his the book? I got his complete works, and they keep on having to do new editions every year because they find more poems, and he has literally like over 2,000 of these poems. He just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote, and the idea that you could write literally thousands of poems in a relatively short life. He died in his 50s. And they all have that technical brilliance in like 4 lines sometimes. Blows my mind.
And I guess that's kind of why you end up becoming a meme at the end of it. It's a similar kind of thing with even Baldwin, when you can articulate something that is so complex in such a succinct way.
A line or two.
Right. And in a language that is accessible, in a language that is potent and visceral. Instagram and the Instagrammers love that kind of thing.
I think some people, I really love the Langston Hughes Twitter account. That's not the real Langston Hughes, FYI. It's basically someone who, I don't know who they are, I love them. They just, depending on what's happening in the news, they just choose a line from his canon. And I was like, who are you? Because you, and people ask questions like, oh, I remember reading this Langston Hughes line that was about
and they just know it.
Books, and and they don't even reply, they just tweet it next. Right. And it's amazing, and I'm genuinely impressed because I've read that whole thing, right? It like on and off, and I feel like I know his canon pretty well, but I'll be like, oh god, which one was that? And this guy just whips it out.
It might be a team of people, isn't it?
Maybe, yeah, but and I think that's really using the social media as a force for literary good.
For good, right, exactly.
Because you do this 2 lines of a Hughes poem and people look up the rest. And I think that's really powerful. And sometimes it's part of a 20-line poem, and other times it's part of a 4-line poem. He's only left out 3 words at the end. Yes. And I think that's really, really useful and helpful. But I don't know. I think it's a shame. I think it's a bit of a disservice. I think the black community sees what a disservice happens when Martin Luther King is memeified, right? And how he,
memeified. I've never heard that.
Is that how I've made that up?
Yeah,
maybe
neologism for Minamore here on the Interlocutor.
But like I see black people regularly saying, "Oh, here are like white people." Martin Luther, they'll take one tiny quote in a long speech about like don't do violence, missing out the paragraphs around that line about how white liberals are. No, that was Malcolm X, but
Cutting out context.
Completely out of context. But people don't have the same need to wonder what the context is with people like Hughes and Baldwin, who were radicals, who are full-on radicals, right? And have...
Well, Thelonious Monk, Nina Simone, they were all part of the same black arts movement. So you think about what they stood for and the time in which they were being contested. It was a real challenge. The documentary
on Nina was good though. Did you watch it?
I did.
That was solid. But that was like her family battling for a long time, and they still have had to deal with like
a lot of things, and there was a whole bag of stuff that they didn't speak
about. Still had to deal with the films about her that are bullshit.
Yeah.
And that's Nina Simone, like.
Bridget, I'm going to ask you one final question. This is why we went to school for this question here.
Oh God.
Garage.
I forgot about
Garage and grime. You thought we were going to talk about analytical and continental philosophy.
I know. You never know with you, Anthony.
Well, garage and grime. How's that shaped your outlook as a writer? How's that shaped what you do? How's it informed your personhood?
I mean, I probably should do as a disclaimer, I'm not the biggest grime head. Like, I've grown to really appreciate grime in the last few years, but I can never put myself forward and say that I know about grime. I was there at the beginning. I wasn't. But I love garage, And I was sort of the end of garage going into dubstep and jungle and that sort of mishmashy where jungle sort of came back in this weird going into dubstep, the very, very early dubsteppy days where you're not sure if it's garage or dubstep or jungle or whatever, and I love that
during that transitional period.
And I think, I mean, to be fair, garage lasted such a short amount of time.
You know what, I was speaking with now obviously Kayo Chingoni and Sabrina Mahfouz have both written about garage extensively, and one of the things that I've kind of contested with them both is that garage never really left the VIP. Politically, it always remained in the club as a theme, as a movement. It never left. You know, if you think of motifs and you think about where it went lyrically, it never went beyond the nightclub. Now, Sabrina would argue, and I've had many discussions with her, that whole reclamation of revelry and celebration was in itself a highly politicized movement, in the fact that you had working class black and brown people celebrating, partying in a nightclub. Careful.
Ooh.
Sneeze, quick sneeze.
Sneezing.
Politically, where do you see the role of garage, and then obviously its transition into grime and British hip hop and the rest of it? How does that fit in the political milieu?
I think garage had a really important. It played a really important role. And I think people do, you know what, normally I'm quick to complain, but I feel like people who know anything about British music will acknowledge that. The thing with garage is that, you know, I guess it hit the mainstream in a really odd way, in that it didn't have breakout stars. I mean, I guess the closest you got was like maybe Artful Dodger, who was a producer, and I guess So Solid and Craig David and Daniel Bedingfield. But, you know, Craig David's career literally took a dive for 15 years because he was... I mean, have you watched the Avid Marian stuff?
No.
Recent. I mean, I actually did. I was talking with a friend about how Ali G had dated so badly, and we were like, oh God, do you remember the Avid Marian Craig David stuff? I mean, I was uncomfortable with it then, but it is so racist and so classist. And that was it really reminded me the perception of garage. That is what it was. That here's Craig David, like a quiet Jewish kid with a beautiful voice, suddenly like mocked on national TV as this like ghetto gang banging idiot with a strong accent.
Was he from Southampton? Or something like that.
Yeah, and you just think how how was that allowed on? It's like lots of things. I don't know, Little Britain, whatever. Yeah. How did all that stuff get on? But it was on TV, and he lost that. Artful Dodger, but he's been in the background, so I think he was able to eschew a lot from that. So Solid were on the front page of God knows what tabloid, called criticised for holding guns and all of that.
They were even labelled as a gang.
Yeah, all of this stuff. And so, and you listen to people like Lisa Maffey have been doing interviews recently in this sort of odd garage semi-revival that we're having at the moment, where they're like, we'd go and do interviews about our music, and people would be like, so how many of them have you got babies with? Are they all your cousins? And she'd be amazing, like, and it's
who's asking these questions?
Like interviewers. And she said that's what happened when she was younger. Yeah. And you think, here are like 3 or 4, literally less than 5 breakout stars, and this is what happened to them. And the only one who sort of got away with it was Daniel Bedingfield, who was white, right?
Yeah. And the most inoffensive white guy.
Oh my God. Yeah. And he was right at the tail end as well. And also lots of them didn't make any money, which is also really sad, especially the women, like just didn't make money for singing on these tracks. And even now, the garage revivals come back with the guys and the DJs and the producers, but you don't hear the women. No one knows what they're called, really. Yeah. And some of the only people who I guess have made it out at that time was Sia, who sang Little Man hilariously. And so she didn't sing garage after she sang that track. And then I guess Kyla, because that's funky. I don't know, funky lasted less than garage, I'm not sure. It lasted about 4 minutes. And she was doing interviews recently with the One Dance staff and Drake, saying, she's just been a mum for the last few years. Like, she didn't make millions from that. They were mismanaged, all of them. And so, I think it was really important. I'd like to think that if garage happened 10 years later, it would have been a very different thing. And I think it would have done, because it's like grime, right? Yeah. Lots of grime artists were clever enough, but also lucky enough to not be massively exploited at the beginning.
But there is that endorsement now from the US over to the UK that garage never had. Like, you've got kind of Drake endorsing Skepta and things like this, whereas when the garage era was at its height, you never really had that same transatlantic symbiosis.
But I don't know. I wonder if Americans. My American friends literally have never heard of garage. My friend, one of my best friends, who's a Californian, was like, I'd never heard of this.
And was it predominant? I wasn't a massive. I was very heavily into rap music, so I wasn't the biggest garage aficionado. But then at the same time, I don't know. Did it ever leave London? Was it very London centric?
As far as I can tell. Yeah. I know it definitely got out to like crappy clubs exist all over the country, right? Oh, yeah. Whether it's in like a tiny village outside of Cambridge or whatever, where there's literally one club. I'm sure garage got out to there, but it definitely felt like a London vibe. And even when it was in like Napa, it was still just full of London kids.
There's people that I used to meet that said, I've never been to Cyprus, but I've been to Napa 15 times. Absolutely fantastic.
I love it too.
And as a Cypriot, you're just like, that's amazing. That's brilliant.
I was talking with a friend about this. I was like, who goes to Napa now? Because there's still a big industry, but I was like, why would you? Like, you can't listen to grime in Napa, right? Yeah.
Well, no, they listen. I don't know.
What are they listening to in Napa?
They listen to trap. They listen to grime. I think they listen to pop music, R&B, hip hop.
That sounds horrible.
But I think even at the time, we forget. I'm 33 now. I was 18, 19 at the time there, and even it was Ja Rule. It was all that kind of stuff that was being played with. Garage MCs coming from London and doing special PAs and stuff like that. So it always had that very mainstream pop vibe. But obviously when you're a kid, you don't really register it in that way.
I am glad there's this sort of odd revival. And I guess it's a sort of hipsterization in a way, isn't it? Yeah. But I'm happy with it. But, last week, it was a friend's birthday. We went to see Oxide and Neutrino, and they're just like... I find garage raves now really comforting because they're not... There's like a bunch of 18-year-olds, and then there's just a bunch of like people who aren't completely off their faces. Yeah. Like, I remember them when I was younger, and everyone was just like completely gone.
I guess it would be the equivalent of us not listening to the Rolling Stones.
Yeah.
Like, it's something that happened 10 years before we were 15 years before we were even born, but we can
you still like it.
Exactly.
But no, I went, like, I just had a few Red Bulls, like, didn't even want to drink. And it's just really nice to like have the music that I just don't think you get in the same way. And people are making garage again. Isn't that amazing?
It's amazing, yeah.
I found this
producer... Would it have that same authentic feel that it had 10, 15 years ago?
So I heard this track. My friend Marina, who does Brainchild with me, was like... listen to this guy, and he's made a garage track. He's like 19. And I was like, this is amazing. Please, I don't know if it will really take off, but I think he's great. He used to do like house. But I think if you're a house DJ, like, I think it makes sense to have your music leak into garage. And I think it's a shame that the house that we get now, and I'm not a big house fan, is like very techno house, where you forget garage and house are bedfellows, right? And if that comes back, I'll be very happy. And I think that really has influenced my poetry. I love pop culture. I love what music does. I can't sing, and I can't produce, and I can't DJ. I'd love to.
But you can write a good pamphlet.
I can write an all right pamphlet.
And a good little essay.
Maybe.
It's been a pleasure, Bridget Minamore. Where can people find out more about your work and endeavours?
I have a website, which is just my full name.com. I am on Twitter, far too much for my own good, at Bridget Minamore. And you can get the pamphlet from Outspoken Press that I think Anthony said before. And you can see me at Brainchild next year in July.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
You are welcome.